Howdy once again, it's Tubalcain, your YouTube shop teacher, and this is tips number 552, and it's entitled The Bernard Pliers Revisited. Now there was a recent video where I talked about Bernard parallel jaw pliers, sometimes also called sergeant pliers. It was a fairly popular video, and I was surprised at two things. Number one was how many people had never heard of this pliers, and number two, how many people had one or remember it or kept one in their tackle box, or their dad had one or their grandpa had one. So it was a mixed bag there of people that were sentimental and people that wanted to learn more about them. So I'm going to wax, I hope eloquently, in this video about these, a little more about the history. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures. If you can bear with me, this will be a long verbose video. But this particular one that I showed you in the last video is in terrible shape. I'm going to take it apart, see if I can recondition it a bit, salvage it, but at the very least, if not less, we'll have it apart so you can see the different parts and how it works. Maybe I should have this in my How It Works video series, I don't know. But anyway, I hope to have a little fun doing this, and I hope you have fun watching it. So let's get on with it. Now, if you haven't seen this recent video, I suggest you watch it if you're interested in this type of subject matter. I'll try to put a link if I can remember to do it, and then you can find it quickly. Some of these Bernard's pliers are very old and often have the patent date on them, but Bernard themselves did not own a factory. They were made by this company in New Haven, Connecticut. The William Schoellhorn Company actually manufactured them, and if you watch the previous video, you know how many different patents that Bernard held. And notice here that they're called Bernard's possession there with an apostrophe. Now on the side of the older ones there is a patent date, and there might be different patents, not all the same one. And there is their little trademark that you'll find on some of them. It's I guess a Saint Bernard, but it doesn't look much like a Saint Bernard. They ought to put a little keg under its neck there, and then you recognize it a little bit better. But that's kind of neat. You'll see that on some of the pliers, but not all. For some reason, even as a small child, I was enamored with trademarks. So that little diamond there on the handles also appears to be one of their trademarks. But looking on the more modern one, nickel plated now, not chrome, quite a different color. There it says Bernard, but it says Sergeant there. So this one has both trademarks, and let's see, what does it say there? This one is manufactured by Sergeant in New Haven. I think they bought out that other company in about 1948. Now I know I'm giving you probably a little more history than you want to know here, but here is one that's marked Sergeant on the handle. I know it's a repeat for some of you, but the name Bernard is no longer used, which saddens a fellow. Now you can still buy pliers like this. There's a firm in Britain called Maun, M-A-U-N, that manufactures them. Also, I just looked in the McMaster car catalog, and you can buy a pair of these. I'm not sure who makes them, but I noticed that on some of them, these were really beautiful handles. I know it's a stamping, but it's fully enclosed there. But I think on some of the more modern ones, you're going to see handles stamped like this that are opened. Now that doesn't necessarily make a tool cheap, although this is probably a fairly cheap one here. But remember that all vice grips are made like that, but with stampings, as were many guns. All the Sten guns and the grease gun and all that were stamping. So much cheaper to make than a Tommy gun. Who cares? Bear with me now. Many of the Bernard patents revolved around the manufacturing and the stamping. So in this one, and there you can look this up, there's the patent number and the Bernard name. This is from 1913. Remember, they were making Model Ts then. And there it shows how the handles were to be formed. There is again the stretch out of it. I feel like cutting one out of paper. Or, you know what else I feel like doing? I feel like sacrificing one of these and just heating it up, taking it apart and flattening it out like that. I think that would be neat. Now that one just shows it. I don't know if that's the finished one or the process. And that's just page 1. Now let me show you the other page. Again, this is the same patent number, page 2, and it does show it being rounded off and fully closed. There probably being the die that closed it. Now, if it saddens you to think of this as a stamped out pliers, but they're very, very rigid and strong. You know, a tube sometimes is just as strong as a forging. Also, they did a nice job here, and this is hollow to reduce the weight also. They did a nice job on some of these of closing it. You can hardly see the seam. Again, that's a very old one that's pretty well worn out, but what I started to say there, I got a little sidetracked, lost my train of thought. But anyway, if you thought this is cheap and tubular and stamped, there are fully machined, forged, and hardened parts. The jaws, for instance, are incredibly hard. And in a repeat here, I'm telling you that these jaws are pretty worn out, but they had a nice serrated finish for grip. Sometimes they call them the bulldog grip, and I'll show you some ads later on. And I also like that V-way that they had in there. Very handy to hold wire or screw or something. These would hold it pretty nice and firm if you were going to grind. Now this one looks like it's lost a little of its parallelism here. Apparently millions were used in the military. Every tool kit, especially the machine gun kits, had one of these. When I was a boy, and even 10 years after the Second World War, into the early 50s, in the back of every magazine, like Popular Science, there were ads for war surplus. Now here's a typical one from Stark's. They were in Chicago. There also was one in Los Angeles called Pally's that I used to buy things from when I was a kid. I just thought that war surplus stuff was so neat. But anyway, shown here is a Bernard pliers for $1.29. I was very encouraged by that last video because I got so many kind responses, and now I realize maybe I'm not as crazy as I thought I was, that there are other people just as kooky that like something as mundane as a tool, whether it be a Bernard or a screwdriver, and that I'm not alone in this world in my love for something so silly as a tool, but I do like them. I have always liked tools. I remember being a boy, a 10-year-old boy or something, and just liking tools, sometimes just for the sake of the tool, rather than using it. It's just such a wonderful thing, and now here we are with an extension of our hands. An added mechanical advantage. All right, enough gabbing now. Let me attempt to take this one apart. As you can see, it's been pretty well butchered, and I did loosen up these screws offhand. Somebody had pounded on this and pretty well closed the slots on the screws, and you can see that they were made in different ways. For instance, this one, Sergeant, is riveted. Except for in the middle here, apparently that screw comes out, but it looks like it's riveted from that side. This real old one is screws, but down here we have rivets. Well, we got rivets down here too. I don't intend to take those apart. Perhaps you remember from the last video when I attempted to cut wire with this one that it won't even cut a piece of baling wire, so to speak. The jaws are no longer in alignment, and trying to cut something thicker like this, watch what happens. It just bends it over. Well, I had pretty much declared this to be junk and was going to throw it away And then I thought, on second thought, I better not. And people get angry when they say that. Well, send it to me, I'll fix it, I can use it. And again, many of these were used in tackle boxes and got rusty. Matter of fact, I had one in my tackle box, but it had extended jaws. It was a more modern one, but it was pretty good for getting fish hooks out of a fish's mouth. Also, if I may reiterate, these were made in thousands of different styles, probably under license, but with different jaws for different purposes. Some even have, the more modern ones have some nylon or plastic jaws or brass jaws or extended jaws. Some were made with punches, and a popular one would cut off leather belting and punch the hole and crimp it and all of that for the old Singer treadle type sewing machine. So just all kinds of different trades used parallel jaw pliers. All right, let's take this apart. Now someone's put a rivet in there, or I guess you could say they took the screw and peened it over, so we'll see if that comes out. No. That'll have to be drilled out or worked on. Let's see what this one does. And that's a special screw that is threaded on the end. There we have one jaw out. Pretty dull cutter. Not only dull, but it's nicked. And there's the other jaw. Let's see. And boy, is that ever hard. So that's a quality piece. Expensive to make. You know, I forgot to mention to you where I actually got this pair of pliers, and can you take a guess? Well, you're right, I got it at Bubba's auction quite a while ago. So let's see if we can get that out. Now I pretty well ground the head off of it. Use a Bernard to fix a Bernard. Okay, and out it comes. And you can see that Bubba did put just a standard stove bolt in there as compared to what it is supposed to have. Now, what I'm still not sure of is what is threaded and what needs nuts and what does not, because if you look at this other rather old one, it has two screws here with some very thin nuts. Because, in fact, the sheet metal here is too thin to be threaded. Actually fairly good condition. You can still see the ripping pattern on it. Some of them are all chewed up on the end by grinders if they were holding something to grind. Now, looking at the rest of this, that's not going to come apart unless I want to sacrifice this as a cutaway, because again we got rivets there, and I'm still not quite sure here why this is riveted just from one side, but it looks to me like probably that allowed them to go ahead and head that rivet by bucking it up with their bucking tool from this side and riveting that. In that operation where they had it together, then it would go to another station, and later on during assembly, during final assembly, they could use this bolt right in here. And again, that's a shoulder bolt. That's a shoulder bolt. And that shoulder bolt went into this jaw. remember now that not all of these pliers had a cutter. Some of them did not have that at all. Which I don't know why you wouldn't, because that's one of the handiest features because of the compound leverage. You have the ability to cut something fairly thick even with a weak hand. I don't know how far I should carry this as far as cleaning it, because you see that Bubba has the handle packed with grease. Hardened grease at that. I'm not sure I want to go to the effort of cleaning that. Or maybe it's dirt. Children often borrowed their dad's pliers, young boys I mean, and they'd end up out in the backyard. I remember sometimes my dad would find one of his rusty tools in our backyard and he was not happy. Alright, I ran into a problem already. We can see here that Bubba just put a standard 1/4-20 thread in there and beat the heck out of the end of it. Probably lost that screw or lost the nut, who knows. So I'm looking at this and thought, well, alright, what size is that? And in checking it here, it doesn't go into the 1/4, but it doesn't even go into the 17/64, it goes into the 9/32. Well, first of all, let me say that everyone in the civilized world knows that often tool manufacturers, especially years ago, adopted their own threads or whatever would fit. Maybe they needed an odd size to fit in this size pliers, so maybe they even manufactured their own screws and their own taps and dies and everything. We don't really know that. I don't think they did it to be ornery, but I used to deal and mess around a lot with Stanley planes, and all of their threads and fasteners were specialized. Alright, let's take the shars here and see what diameter this is. Well, it's 270. What the heck is 270? I went through several books here, including the machinery handbook. There is nothing in there that is close to that. That's just a little bit over 1/4 inch. So I got to thinking here. I'm a bit discouraged, I don't mind telling you. Well, then I thought, well, maybe it's metric. Well, they didn't do metric things in Connecticut in 1898, now did they? But I went over to my metric, cracking myself up all of a sudden. Went over to my metric set, that is 7 millimeters. Well, why did I grab 7 millimeters? So let's back up to this. First of all, again, Bubba used 1/4 inch, or did I do that already? That's 1/4 inch bolt. This Bernard is 271, but if I click on metric, it's 6.88 millimeters. Well, that's not very far from 7. Matter of fact, for all intents and purposes, that is 7. Well, that's why I went over and grabbed a 7 millimeter tap, and I thought, wonder if that'll fit in there. And you know what? It does. It does. So, can I go down to Ace Hardware and get a 7 millimeter bolt and modify it and get some nuts? And I know the nuts are going to be way out of proportion, but let me go to the hardware store and see what I can come up with. And then I'll get back to you. Otherwise, well, even for me to make my own screw, what size am I going to thread it? I probably would have to make it, you know, about 7 millimeter and then reduce it near the end after the bolt passed through, so it had to be very precise, and then use some other nut that I adopt. But I probably would want to make 2 of them so the 2 sides matched and looked good. Or am I wasting my whole day here, or several days, on a piece of junk? But in the meantime, I will clean these up. But what I had originally thought here is that I would be able to very easily show you what the action of the pliers is. But on this rivet here, or fixed pin perhaps I should say, notice that it allows that jaw to slide in and out. And if I may just temporarily put this bolt in there to hold it in place, like that. you can see what's happening. I don't think I really explained what it's doing, but that's the general principles here of keeping the two jaws parallel. All right, I'll see you tomorrow after I do some investigative shopping. I do not know if 7mm would be considered a fairly average size, but that would be available at the hardware store in their little kits. But we know that there is a 7mm thread, and the pitch on that, if I can read it, you know, even with my Optivisor, sometimes I have to use this. That's a 7mm, and the pitch is 1mm, and that simply means it's 1mm from one thread to the next. Now, I don't remember if that's the coarse or the fine, but I would use whatever is available. If they, and I do mean available. So in the meantime, I'll clean these parts real well, degrease them, maybe wire brush them a bit. Take some still pictures because I think this is interesting. And so do you guys that have mechanical minds. All right, it's the next day and I slept on this problem, and here's what I came up with. First of all, I have one drawer with metric screws, and they're just oddballs that I picked up one place or another. But of course, I couldn't find one that would fit in this pliers, because I have determined now that it is about 7mm. Alright, there's no 7mm in here. Let's go on down to Ace Hardware Store and I'll show you a little footage from that. There'll be no sound. As you can see from that footage, all the selections that they had there at Ace, and they had a nice selection, but I have determined that 7mm is a hermaphrodite size even within the metric community. But I did find the one drawer there, as you saw, but the bolts were way too large and out of proportion. That is, the heads were too large, and there just wasn't really anything that I could use. But for 30 cents I bought a 7mm nut. One nut. And there it is, and you can see how grossly out of proportion this is. The overall size is too large, and it's way too thick. It just looks ridiculous. So, then that's like something Bubba would do. They need to be proportional to the tool size. So what I did is I took some 1032 nuts. Look at the difference now. Put them in the lathe and tapped them 7mm. So I tapped 5 of them because I'll be losing one. Always make an extra. I do have a set of metric taps and dies. It's the super set, you know. So there's the taps. The lower part is the dies, and there is the 7mm, and that's what I used for the nuts, and I'll show you what I did next. There's the metric tap and die, and I took a piece of 5/16 rod, turned it down to 7mm, and threaded the end. And in other words, I'm making my own bolts. So there'll be just a short shaft, 7mm. It'll be threaded on each end, and I'll put Loctite on those. So that's how I'm going about this. So that's what it's going to look like. And this end, of course, will be threaded and cut off. I need to make 2 of those, and I have 1 half made already. So that's going to work just fine. It's just that it's very tedious, and there's a lot of things to do. to make little studs. They're actually studs is what they are. Story time. Now here's what happened in 1948 when Sargent took over from Bernard, or from that other company, whichever way it was. They came in on a Monday morning and told all employees in the office and the factory there'll be absolutely no changes. It's business as usual. Well, of course, they had a board meeting, and by Friday of that week they had issued 300 pink slips, laid off a huge number of people. A lot of engineers were gone, and to replace those personnel, they brought in bean counters, 30 bean counters, headed by Robert McNamara, who was on leave from Ford Motor Company at that time. And they looked over the product and they said, you guys are insane using nuts and bolts there, because they can fall apart, it costs more to do, we're going to rivet it. And there were thousands of out-of-work aircraft workers that were expert riveters at the time, and matter of fact, the #1 person they hired was Rosie, and they were able to save 7 cents per unit by doing that. End of story. All right, I'm back from the rant, and I'm going to go ahead and finish this off camera, because you've seen me turn and thread and all of that countless times. Also, I believe that I'm going to put this into some evaporust, however you say it. There's a little bit of rust. I did clean it up real well, but not good enough yet. Now, another thing here, I had to laugh. I told you this was packed by grease, with grease, by Bubba. So I thought, well, no problem. I put a drill bit in there. Well, I instantly ruined the drill bit and came to the realization that someone had put concrete, I'm going to call it mortar. That's mortar. And it's murder. So there's about an inch worth of hardened mortar in there that is impenetrable, and it isn't hurting anything, but it does bother me. So anyway, we'll soak this a little bit, wire brush it. I won't show any of that, but when I come back, I should have that done and the screws made. Well, I'm back, and it's the next day. I haven't used the deruster yet, but I do have one of the studs in place. The other one is right here. All I have to do is thread it and cut it to length, but that's what they're going to look like, of course. Now, a couple things here. First of all, I wanted to explain this again. I guess I already did. This is 1/4 inch bolt. This is a 5/16 bolt. Now, even though there's only a 1/16 of an inch difference, sometimes we need a size that's in between, as I am doing right now with the 7mm. But I took a piece of 5/16 rod, so the purple piece here is 5/16 in diameter. The small end is been turned down to 1/4 inch, and then this section here has been turned down to 7mm. So that's one place here in the Imperial system where I don't believe they have enough thread. So in other words, there's nothing between this, and I had to use a metric size, or in the case of Sargent, they made up their own sizes. But I want to show you a couple other things here before I get on with it. And #1 is that this tool has been abused. A lot of tools have been. That's not unusual, but you can see it's been pounded there. We got a burr, and on this side we got some really big burrs. I am going to take those off with a file. I do not really like doing that, but I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. I already did remove burrs from the jaws, although they're hardened, so there weren't a lot of burrs. Now, the other thing is here, since I have it half assembled, I did attempt to cut wire, and it is not cutting wire. Why? Well, because at some point the tool has been sprung a little bit, and if I would tighten up this stud enough to close up that little gap there and possibly align the two jaws here, cutting jaws, cutting blades, it would work, but then it becomes too stiff to move. The other thing is that someone has ground on this. In other words, they've changed the geometry that the factory provided. You can see different facets on there. So it's hopeless because if I grind or file any more off of it, it's not going to close because this is already in the closed position. So there's nothing that I can do with the cutter. All right, I'll be gone for a little while I finish this up. That's what it looks like from one side. Now on this side I temporarily put that oversized out of proportion nut from Ace Hardware on there just so you could see what it looks like. And that's what I am not going to use because I think proportion is kind of an important thing when you're restoring it, although this isn't a full restoration. But there's my homemade nut, and I have to remove just a little bit, tighten it up and remove just a little bit off the end of the thread. Then I will Loctite, well eventually I think I'll Loctite all 4 nuts on, because when they're lost, and that's what probably happened to Bubba, is that one of them was lost, and he would not have had the capability possibly of doing anything about it other than to ram a 1/4-inch stove bolt in there. I have a rhetorical question for you, and this is a Colombian vise which I love. Now I also own several other vices, including 2 Wilton bullet vices. But why is it that the bullet vices are so coveted and so driven up in price when they really are only a mediocre vise? And they're going to cost you about $400 for a brand new one, but with the round ram at the high school, the kids destroyed several of them by bending that ram. And so I did not think very much of Wilton vices at the time, and when they failed, I would buy Colombians, which I don't think are available anymore, but keep your eye open for them. Parker also is a wonderful vise. If you see that big orange vise out in my garage, that monster that I can't even lift, A-bomb size, that's Parker, Charles Parker. Well, I'm going to file this. Got off topic again, didn't I? I'm going to remove some of these burrs here that are bothering me. Now, I've used Evaporust before, Evaporust. How do you pronounce that? I paid $15 for that at the time, and so this has been used. But let me point out that I have about 10 or 12 videos on rust removal, some of them older. I'll put a link here at the top. Take a look at that and click on some of those. The one that's entitled The Olympics of Rust Removal covers all of the different possibilities, including electrolysis. So check those out if you're in the mood. So I needed a container here. I don't like to use an enormous pan, and it needs to be plastic, not metal. So that, that's going to fit in there perfectly. And again, a contribution of Mrs. Peterson. She's very organized, so she buys these Rubbermaid drawer dividers, So don't tell her about that, but that's what I'm going to use. I know that gag's getting kind of old, isn't it? Alright, here we go, and I think I'll let it set for about 3 or 4 hours. Maybe I didn't use this because it sure looks very clean, doesn't it? Now, you can get this at Horror Freight and many other places, but I think it's up to about $25 a gallon now. Oh, I know where I got it. I got it off of eBay. Yeah, that's where it came from. So let's let that set. There's not a whole lot of rust on this piece, or these pieces, so I'll see you after lunch. Okay, about 8 hours has passed, and I see a Walmart tag on this, so I bought that at Wally World. Forgot all about it. Okay, I don't see a whole lot of difference there, or material floating around or anything like that, but I am going to go ahead and rinse it and douse it with some oil and then proceed tomorrow to put it back together. Okay, it's a day later and here are all of the parts ready to go. They've been de-rusted. They do not look great because I took all of the black finish off, but I've washed them off in hot water and then oiled them thoroughly, so they're a little messy. But I'm going to go ahead and put them together, and then this is the final assembly, and I'm going to use a little bit of this on the nuts, safety lock, and we'll see how that works. When I made up these nuts several days ago, I looked everywhere to try to find some unplated nuts, older stock nuts, which I could not find. I really do not like the looks of the plating on this unplated surface here. Now, some of you are going to say, why don't you put some gun blue on it or paint it or something like that? But for now, it's just going to stay as is. It's never going to look brand new. And remember, I still have dysfunctional jaws here. If I can get the light right. The alignment is gone because of incorrect sharpening and possibly a little springing of the entire unit. But that's pretty much going to have to be it. So that completes the at least partial restoration, or I don't know, it wasn't a restoration I guess, but she's ready to go and serve maybe another 50 years of life. Now at the end of the video I have about a dozen or more still pictures of advertising from Popular Science, Popular Mechanics way back in the 30s and 40s showing how they went about marketing this. Pretty clever ad, so take a look at those too. Thank you so much for watching this 5-minute video that took 35 minutes. This is tubalcain saying so long for now.